So yeah, interactive data journalist. So I'm like finding data, analysing data, visualising data, writing about data, standing up in front of people, talking about data. Part of that is sport, but the FT is a bit of a weird beast when it comes to sport. So when I joined the FT, which was about 18 months ago, there was no sport on the back page. There was no sport on the inside at all. We of course report on sport from a business perspective. So things like some of you might have seen the scoop we had this week on the bid for the new Formula One from US and Qatari. So we covered it from a business side of things, but not at all from a sports side kind of thing. But I was told that this was part of the FT's complex relationship with sport, and that what had happened, I think it was for London 2012, was that the message went out that we're the FT, we cover serious shit, we're not going to piss about any of the sports stuff. And then the day before the Olympics, sort of various editors descended and were like, oh, we need a massive thing on the Olympics. So I knew there was this sort of, the FT loves sport but doesn't do sport, and everyone there is very serious business journalists, and yet when the Ashes are on, every single screen in the office will be showing cricket. So it's a bit of a weird one, but where my story in this particular area begins is in the lead up to the World Cup in Brazil. As someone who is just a bit of a data geek, also like massive sports geek, particularly stuff like football, I've just been trying to, as a way to teach myself a few new skills that will come in handy in my day job, so just general sort of analysis and visualization techniques. I've been spending the odd half hour in an evening or a weekend just sort of hacking together a little visualization of every team taking part in the World Cup and sort of its statistical identity. For those of you who follow or are familiar with the work of Ted Knutson on Twitter, I was using radar charts, so I'll just give you a quick idea of so this is the kind of idea. So a chart where the distance between the centre and the edge determines the value of a particular, in this case, a player's attribute. So what you end up with is the area inside a shape tells you sort of their overall ability. And anyway, I was just hacking around with this in weekends and evenings. It was never something that I particularly expected would get published. It was something I thought would be awesome if it did. But I was just fiddling around with this in my spare time, and then again, I think it was sort of the day before the World Cup kicked off. I basically just twizzled my screen around to my boss, who's executive, and sort of said, "Oh, by the way, I've been fiddling around with this in free time. Can we make any use of it?" And he's a little bit into the sport as well, so his eyes lit up straight away, and I was like, awesome, my run just completely wasted all that time. So we published it, and what you can see there, if I just show you that. So the idea was that for every team, we created a little radar chart like this. So what you're looking at is, based on all the players who are in that squad, it's how many, everything of course is adjusted for time on pitch. It's based on the previous football season, so 2013-14, and I split them up into orange attacking attributes, blue defensive attributes, red passing attributes, and you're then looking at within that individual things like goals, non-penalty goals per 90, shooting accuracy, etc. for attack. For defence, you're looking at tackles, interceptions, fouls, that kind of thing. And then we've got different types of passing and passing success rates. So the general takeaway you can get from that is the larger area overall indicates higher quality teams overall, such as Brazil, smaller areas overall, lower quality teams. So this is kind of a dual function visualization. On the one hand, you can just browse through each group and look at sort of the overall strength of the group. There we have the group England were in, and then within that you can explore where a team's strengths and weaknesses lie. And what we then added at the top was this ability to, for any given match that was on that evening, you could say, okay, I want to look at what would happen if chili paste Brazil, I can compare the two, see where the strengths and weaknesses are. So we did this, and people loved it on Twitter, and that was awesome. Even though I think, obviously, it said Brazil were going to do quite well, it also said Spain were going to do really well, so guys of those were, I think, we're particularly proud of. But anyway, went out there and did well, and then completely coincidentally, about 3 months after that, the physical print newspaper at the FT was being completely redesigned. And one of the people in charge of that just came over and tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Oh yeah, like, we're thinking of having a sports page this time. Do you want to have like a weekly sports column, like a sporting statistics column?" And so after I'd like got back up off the floor, I was like, "Yeah, that sounds pretty cool." So there's now myself and a guy called Gavin Jackson, who's one of our statisticians and general markets reporters, are tasked with every week, and there's a bit of sort of what I've commonly called squad rotation as well. So we do, like various other people at the FT who are sports geeks as well will write the other thing. But basically every Sunday online and in Monday's paper, we're tasked with taking an interesting sporting story, or perhaps like a myth that we've busted, perhaps it's a theory that we're testing, where it's underpinned by numbers. So sometimes it's football, tennis, Formula One, cricket. We did a couple on triathlon of all things, just because there's some particularly rich data sets that are publicly available, just where in terms of sort of every competitor's start, finish, and split times, that kind of thing. So it's really, really fun, and it's allowed us to experiment a lot with analysis techniques, with visualization techniques, and to kind of attract perhaps a slightly new audience to the FT who weren't expecting us to be covering this kind of stuff. And again, we're really able to sort of interact with the community that we get around this kind of stuff on Twitter and blogs. So I'm just going to go through like 2 or 3 more specific examples of things we've done, which some of you might have seen, some of you might not have seen, all of them particularly on football. And yeah, just talk about again the techniques we're using there, the kind of similar to what Brian was talking about earlier in terms of general visual techniques you can use to attract attention, and also some of the things we've maybe got wrong, or some weaknesses we've had, which again I think has been a really important part of what we've learned from doing this. And then I'm going to have a little bit at the end about what other people within the mainstream media are doing in this space, which is particularly interesting, and then just other bloggers and people in general. So, one of the examples that I was particularly pleased with recently, and was heavily inspired by what other people in the football analytics blogging community were doing, was one where we wanted to look at squad usage and sort of squad composition throughout the Premier League. And this all started when I came across this chart, which was one of a few in a series that Benjamin Pugsley, one of the football analytics bloggers, had put together. So what he was looking at here is there've been several ongoing narratives basically over the last season which this type of chart speaks to. So what we're looking at here is the number of starts that a given player made in the domestic season. I think vertical is age, and then the size of these circles indicates the time left on the contract. So you're kind of looking at several stories here. The key one that Ben was pulling out here, which really spoke to me and I wanted to then try and sort of replicate on a larger scale, was this thing that Mourinho knew his best 11 this season like pretty much no one else in the league. Those 11 players you see on the right, that's his first 11 that started the overwhelming majority of games week in, week out, which tells you one of the success stories of Chelsea's season. They didn't have to swap players in and out, and they were able to rely on their best 11 being there pretty much every week. The other thing that stands out is this isn't a particularly old squad, and in fact a lot of these players are between this sort of 26 to 28, 29 age range in terms of the core 11, which again is kind of your ideal squad. And if I'm sure if you guys think back to Mourinho's time at Inter, he did a very similar thing. Pretty much straight away he was bringing in the likes of Lucio or to Samuel. So players in that kind of age range, that kind of experience range, very injury-free, who you usually like. But anyway, so I saw that, and also a tweet from Ben Torbaney, who'd taken a similar idea. So similar thing, he's flipped the axes, so again you've got age and time played, but he added these arrows showing how long players are contracted for, which is another important part of the story. So it's no good having a solid core of 11 players that you can rely on week in, week out, if some of them are on loan or their contracts are expiring, because you can't then build forward to the next season. So the ones here who have pretty much no arrow progressing at all are the players who, in this case, Burnley may have been using a lot but couldn't rely on having in the future. So Danny Ings played a lot of football. Danny Ings no longer at Burnley. A couple of other players in there like Michael Keane, who they had on loan. So I saw these two charts and I thought what would be super interesting is to make something like this, but add a bit more interactivity to it, and also add the option for someone, a fan of any team in the Premier League, to be able to dive into and explore. So what we made was this. Cool. So same idea, taking inspiration from both of those two, and sort of maybe sort of adding a little bit more stylistic, a more stylized look at it. And then what we did is we made this into a sort of narrative interactive visualization. So whether you're on your desktop, your iPad, or your mobile, you can swipe through this or click next and see what we go through. So started off with a bit of an intro. The last season just finished. Gives us a big data set to explore, which clubs used what players, and it allows us a starting point to then go on from. So I've labelled a few outliers here. So we see, in this case, at team level, instead of each of these dots representing an individual player, each of these dots represents kind of all of those players from a team rolled into one. So what we were talking about earlier, Chelsea and Burnley are both teams who have players playing the central 11 players, like the core of their squad, playing a huge majority of the total available pitch time, and the position of this circle indicates the squad's age. So straight away from this sort of aggregate top level view, the key stories we kind of seeing are, number one, that story that Chelsea and Burnley, so obviously opposite ends of the table, were the squads who were most sure of their best 11. Best 11 plays sort of 83-84% of the total pitch time. The other one we get is that if you look at the positions of the circles, Man City are the oldest squad. That's looking from left to right in the entire league, which is another big narrative that various people in the analytics squad community have highlighted. City are not only underperforming, they've also got a very old squad, and these players that you see from the streak there, it's not only an old squad, it's a squad that's contracted for a long time. Tottenham and Liverpool, although they didn't have great seasons, they can at least look at the fact that they have two of the youngest, the two youngest squads in the league, and those players are contracted for a long time, and therefore they develop. And the other interesting one, perhaps, is looking at United and Arsenal, who are right down here, i.e. lots of squad rotation. Their core 11, the 11 players for each of those teams who played the most football, only played about 2/3 of their minutes. So in Arsenal's case, you could maybe argue that's because of the versatility they've got. They can throw out a Cazorla, throw in a Wilshere, throw out Giroud, throw in Walcott. In United's case, you might also argue that it's a case of squad depth. You might argue that Van Gaal for a while didn't know what his best team was and swapping players around. But again, straight away you've got this aggregate view telling you all sorts of different stuff. So what we can then do, and I've just highlighted a couple of those cases here, but what we can then do is drill down from this aggregate view into individual clubs. So you remember me talking about what Ben Hunt did with Chelsea. Well, let's now have a look at that in a different way. So we're zooming out from the club to all the players. So we can see Hazard, Ivanovic, and if I just hover over, I think that'll be Terry. These completely interactive, so you look over, you see an outlier, you can explore. So these are players who play almost 100% of the available minutes of league football. Matic is there. Courtois, and Oscar is the 11th of those 11 in terms of being in the first 11 and playing the least pitch time. But again, the key really is this huge gulf between those 11 and the others. And so again, what we did was added some interactivity so that you can then go through and, you can just pick any team. So let's say I'm interested in Tottenham, come down here, click on that, and we can see the same thing for Tottenham. Let's say I'm interested in where Harry Kane fits into that. There he is, and so on. So the idea here was to take inspiration from some really smart analysis and visualizations that people have done elsewhere on the web and turn it into something that could both tell the story to people who aren't of this community, people who didn't know what was going on, and could also then allow much deeper exploration. So if I just go on to another one, this was one we did quite early days. So this entire weekly series started in September of 2014. Sorry, so we're sort of coming up to a year through it. And one of the earliest things we wanted to do was take this idea that wages are a great predictor of a club's wage bill and how they're going to perform, where they're going to finish in the league. And so we were running this in sort of October, I think, so fairly early into the Premier League season. We wanted to test at that point in the season, so after sort of 6 or 7 matches, what is a better indicator of where a club is going to finish in the league? Is it how they're performing after 6 or 7 games, or is it simply how much their players are paid? And this was also one where we got something slightly wrong and dealt with that, but which again I think is a key part and one of the best things about this community that we all operate in to a greater or lesser extent. It's the fact that you're able to just go out onto Twitter, go out into the blogs and just chat amongst one another, swap ideas, improve one another's methodology, and for me this is one of the most fun parts about being in this space. So let's see if I can find this one. So again, the idea here was take a look at, that was the Premier League after one game had been played, obviously not much is going on. After 6 rounds, there'd been quite a lot of movement. Liverpool at that point, there was a lot of doubt over how they would perform, but ultimately with no idea where people were going to end up at the end of the season. So the first thing we did was plotted what had happened the previous season. So at this point, anyone can just come in and see what happened to their club. Everton, we can see there, I think this would have been their first season under Martinez, we can see that from there. And obviously Liverpool fans will want to look away in terms of that private slip at the end. But the key part of this story was, this looks crazy at first, but hopefully this is quite a fun animation that you'll see in a minute. We wanted to show, again, to people who either don't know a huge amount about football or, in this case more, don't know a huge amount about statistics, we wanted to show this idea that the correlation between a club's position on day 1 of the season and after they've played 38 matches is obviously going to steadily improve throughout the season. The question again that we started on is, at what point does a club's position in the league become a better indicator of where it's going to finish than its wage bill was throughout? So what we decided would be quite a fun way to do this is show the correlation between the team's position after it's played X number of matches, in this case 1, and the team's final position. And this was based on, I think, 15 or so seasons of Premier League data, which is why you've got all those dots there. So after 1 match has been played, pretty much no pattern, the team could have picked up 3 points and end up relegated. It could be in the top or end up in the bottom 4. So here's what happens after 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 matches have been played. We're starting to see more of a correlation again, as we would expect. After 10 matches have been played, the team's going up towards the top of the table. There's less of a variation involved there, so their position after 10 matches is a better indicator of where their position will be after 38. But you can see there's still a hell of a lot of spread there. So we speed it up a little bit now and we see how that develops over the next sort of 25 matches. And that's where we are after 37. So with 1 match left to play, the team's position is almost completely a match for where it's going to end up after 38. But there is, of course, a little bit of shuffling that happens in the last day of the season. and so after 38, there's our perfect correlation. So that was just a bit of a nice way to just show something that we all completely understand, we all know is the case anyway, but just a nice way to demonstrate that visually. The key is coming back to our question of at what point does the correlation between the team's position surpass the correlation that you get simply from looking at its wage bill. So what we're now looking at is the correlation coefficient between a team's position after any number of matches and its final position. So this is just a static demonstration of what we saw in that last animation. So after one match has been played, it's way down at sort of 0.1, starts to level off after sort of half of the season as we might expect, and flicks up at the end to 1. But the key question again is at what point do we cross that threshold? So 67% of variation in the team's final league position can be explained before the season even starts by looking at its wage bill. So the question for us is, at what point do we cross that 0.67 mark? And what we found from doing that analysis was that it's after, annoyingly, it was at this, one of these points where the line flicked up and down, so we didn't have one nice clean number. But it's after approximately 13 matches. The league table, as you look at it, is a better indicator of the final league table than simply looking at the club's wage bill. So the thing we've got wrong is initially when we were looking at the wage bill correlation, we overstated how good a predictor that was because we were averaging data for clubs over multiple seasons, when we should have been treating them all as individual data points. So I think initially we were saying that it was only after 22 matches that we crossed that threshold, when it's actually after 13. But still, I think quite an interesting story about basically at what point, if 6 games in next season you're a Liverpool fan and going 18, not saying that will happen, particularly after familiarise, but you never know. Do you need to panic, or can you actually just look at the wage bill and think, that's okay, we're gonna finish within the top 5 or 6? And again, I think hopefully quite a visually engaging way that we told that for people who weren't already familiar with it. So one last one. This one was quite fun. It was a lot more narrative, a lot less statistics heavy, but it's a classic story that will always be written by, I'd say, at least 2 mainstream media sites in the lead up to Christmas. Is that everyone watch out for Kevin Nolan getting suspended over Christmas or something because he wants to spend time with his family on holiday or whatever. And everyone runs it every year. Sometimes it's known, sometimes they just refer to it as a general concept. But this idea that there's always people picking up that 5th yellow card of the season or something so that they can get a bit more positive time over the new year. And I didn't know if this was going to play out and be true or not, but it was something I was interested to look at. So I think the source we used for this, I can't remember actually, it might have been the site transfermarket.co.uk, which I'm not somebody familiar with. It's basically a site that somewhere had a list of every player's discipline record, so every time they picked up a yellow card or a red card, and at what point they've done so. And so what we wanted to do here was look at when people have picked up their bookings, at what point they become suspended, so whether it was because of a straight red, 2 yellows in a match, or picking up a 5th, 10th or 15 yellow. We wanted to look at what point, basically the number of players who are suspended each week, and see does it spike just before Christmas. So if I look into that one. Here we go. So it's a bit of a tradition that story will get written. So the chart that you're looking at here says, just go to the bottom of it, so I'll just zoom back out. So this is the number of matches that have been played in the game week 3 to 38, and the number of players who've been banned each week. And straight away you go through, that's interesting. There does seem to be a little spike there. There does seem to be something interesting going on. So let's see at what point of the year that is. So if we go through to here, the number of players receiving straight reds, second yellows, or their 5th yellow does actually peak around Christmas. So I mean, does the story end there then? So yeah, people do tend to get suspensions around that time of the year. Well, let's have a look. So let's break it down. Let's break it down into different types of suspension. So same data shown here, but we've gone from the total number of bans to the bans for different reasons. So what we see straight away is that bans for second yellows and for straight reds, pretty there they fluctuate a bit as the season goes along, but there's not really any particular time when players are flying in with the 2-foot tackles or having a go at the linesman. They just fluctuate throughout the season. So the thing that really is changing is this 5th, 10th, or 15th yellow, which are the ones that can pick you up a single match ban. So let's look at the same thing, but stripping out the second yellows and the straight reds. So now we're only looking at bans that people got for 5, 10, 15 yellows. So we've already discussed that peak that we saw pre-Christmas. But there's another interesting one here, is that the way it plummets off at what we find is the end of February. So those of you who already have an inkling about what's going on here might have realised that it's actually all about the FA's rules about the point at which the cards are tallied up and your 5th, 10th or 15th counts for a ban. So until 2009, 2010, if you got to the end of February and you'd only had 4 yellows, you were fine. If you had your 5th, you'd get a ban. So yeah, a player receiving their 5th yellow on or before the last match in February would get a ban. If they got their 5th yellow on the 1st of March, no ban. However, when the rules changed, you suddenly see that spike move. So the cut-off after which a 5th yellow would get you suspended was brought forward in the 2010-11 season from the end of February to the new year. So when we split that data out, and again each of these lines is showing the number of players banned for receiving their 5th, 10th, 15th yellow, and we see that when the rule changed, that cliff that dropped off got brought forward. So both follow the general pattern. Increase in bans as you approach the cut-off point, as you'd expect, followed by a sharp drop because if you receive a yellow card after the cut-off, it doesn't matter. However, there is still a little bit of evidence of a spike just before Christmas. But here we've got a slightly different way of showing the same data. So now we're looking at not suspensions, but the raw number of 5th yellow card incidents in each game since 1996. So regardless of whether or not a player was suspended, we're just looking at the number of times someone received their 5th yellow card. So again, we see that both before and after the cut-off point was changed, apart from a bit of noise, the rate at which people got their 5th yellow card pretty much stayed the same. So basically what we conclude therefore is that that peak, that sort of sharp rise at the end of December, it's actually kind of what you'd expect, because if that cut-off point wasn't there, the line would simply continue up. You'd get more and more players accumulating their 5th yellow card as time went by, because a lot of players were already been on 3 or 4. So the reason it looks like there's a little uptick at New Year is simply because you're going from a steadily increasing line to a sudden drop. So yeah, as we summarised it, players aren't deliberately trying to get sent off, they're trying to get suspended over Christmas. It's actually simple math and help from the FA's rule change that caused that to come about. So it's, I think, a particularly interesting example of where you really need the contextual knowledge of the rule changes, because otherwise it would be quite easy to simply look at the data, look at exactly the same data and say, yeah, we've got a spike there, so clearly it is true that people are trying to get sent off more around New Year. But by combining that quantitative side with the qualitative side, speaking to the FA, going through, digging around in a few forums to find out when the rules will change, that kind of thing, a true story of true view. So that's enough of kind of stuff. I've been working on, we've been working on. So a couple more minutes. I'm just going to mention a few of the other places in the mainstream media that I think are doing really interesting stuff in terms of sport analytics. So the first one is the guys over at 538, Nate Silver's spin out from the New York Times. For those of you who aren't aware of them, they're the sort of pure data journalism, data-driven storytelling website. They cover all sorts of stuff, not only sports. But I think they get the storytelling side of the sporting statistics. They pretty much nail that. So I know in Dan's talk at the very start of today's session, he was bemoaning the sort of sensationalist way a lot of journalists and a lot of outlets will write about sports. And this headline, you can argue, is an example of just that. But when you actually read the piece, it's by a guy called Benjamin Morrissey. I think he's one of their top statistical writers, in my opinion. It's a really, really lengthy examination of Messi. So in this one, you're looking at the number of matches players have played versus the number of goals they scored, and you see Messi and Ronaldo as crazy outliers there. They're then looking at things like shooting efficiency versus volume. So the key one here being that Ronaldo takes more shots, but he's less accurate. But I mean, the broad point here is that it's a classic example of what I think 513 do really, really well, which is writing stories which are clearly underpinned by an enormous amount of analysis, but writing them from a fan's standpoint. So I'm sure you guys all know this, and it kind of goes back to what Brian was alluding to as well about there's kind of a backlash against a lot of people trying to do quantitative stuff in sport, because the people, whether they're fans, whether they're coaches, there's always a like gut instinct which is to say, you don't know what you're on about, mate, like you haven't been out there and seen it. And what I think the guys the team at 513 do really well is they write about this in a really accessible way. So even though they're sort of econometricians and that kind of stuff, they're writing this in a way that any old fan or someone who doesn't even know who Lionel Messi is, they're dragged into it, they read it, and they're interested. The upshot of the New York Times, that's sort of their internal data site. Again, they're doing really, really interesting stuff in this space. They did a great piece when the World Cup happened about the unfairness of the system FIFA used to draw teams into different groups. And they basically ended up they came up with this little model which shows, if you look at the blue line, this is the chance that a team has of getting an easier or hard draw if you were to do X number of random draws using the method FIFA used. This is the draw the team actually got, and this is what they propose as a better method based on team strength for drawing teams into groups. And what they then did is they showed for every single team taking part in the World Cup who had the easier draws, who had the tougher draws, and more importantly, and that's indicated by the black line, more importantly, could it be improved by using this alternative draw system? So could you avoid having as many groups of death and kind of like farcically easy groups if you used a fairer draw system? So those are a couple of places that are doing particularly good stuff. Various individuals I've got there as well. Kurt Goldsberry, for those who don't know, does incredible data analysis and visualization on basketball data. He got into this, I think, like a lot of people, myself included, I don't know how many people, by finding websites that contain a lot of information, scraping stuff off them, and I think this was a rare example where the site Goldsberry scraped all his basketball data from actually turned around and instead of telling him to stop what he was doing and crashing their servers, they actually pretty much brought him in-house and he's been doing amazing stuff. I think he's now dead spin. Dan Altman does some incredibly good, really, really high-level analysis on football, on teams and players, and sort of trying to go beyond things like the expected goals ratio to look at metrics that can sort of assign a qualitative player on any part of the pitch, whether they're a striker or not. Jonathan Liu might look a bit incongruous up there, and I don't even know if he would want to be considered as a particularly statistical journalist. But I think he's another one who does really well at writing pieces which are underpinned by a lot of analysis but made very accessible to the average reader. Sean Ingle at The Guardian, both in terms of the stuff he does and in terms of being just a mainstream traditional journalist, but someone who really gets the significance of analytics and what it can do for football. Another really interesting one. And there's a link in here as well to Sports Geek, which is a email newsletter I discovered the other day, which basically each week will pin you a list of all sorts of interesting statistical stories in all sorts of sports. I will tweet out a link to my presentation which has all of those links in it for anyone who's interested. I've been running it for ages, so if anyone has any questions, fire away.
You know the squad profile and stuff, the World Cup,
Yeah.
each team.
Yeah.
So did you take an average of all their players within that 23-man squad and then?
So what we did, it's a while ago I almost forgot, but I think what we did is we took the five best players for each metric and averaged those. Because obviously there's no point knowing that not having goals penalty of like their left back.
Yeah.
So I think it was fine. We took certainly the top X